Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. And I'm joined here by the creators of Mark of Death, the first comic whose first volume here is subtitled Year of the Rat. And Mark of Death is written and created by my two guests here, Elle León Nostas and Andrew Penczner. Could you just introduce yourselves with your names so that people can hear which voice is which?
Sure. I'm Elle León.
And I'm Andrew Penczner.
Great. And how about just for starters, there's a couple of things that I think are worth talking about when it comes to Mark of Death. But one thing I think that's a really useful approach for writers to take is something that so something I kind of want to focus on, at least initially here, is you've taken a really difficult thing for a lot of writers to do and managed to do it pretty well in this first issue that I've been looking at here, which is take a story that has a lot of moving parts and a lot of setup required and make it not boring. I can't tell you how many times I see a story that has that level of like setup that it needs, and we're just sitting there listening to people talk for an hour with nothing happening, and it drives me crazy whenever I see it. And I call it in movies. I make fun of movies for the phenomenon of getting the team together.
Oh,
It's like
geez.
it's the X-Men, and to spend an hour getting the team together. The team is the X-Men. I know who the X-Men are. Like we don't need to see them get together for an hour before something happens, right? And so something you really are avoiding here is that kind of lull and lag. Like there's a lot of action, a lot of stuff happening, like in this first issue of Mark of Death, even though it's just one issue. You have so much going on. It would, I think, be very easy for it to become confusing. But it actually is, pretty clear. So I wonder if you could just start with just talking a little bit about what is the premise of Mark of Death, and sort of the things that you are kind of setting up here in this first issue, because I think what people will see very quickly is that premise is not necessarily a simple premise, but you're handling, and then once we kind of get a handle on what it is, it'd be great to talk through some of the ways in which you're kind of handling setting this thing up. So what is Mark of Death in a nutshell?
Yeah, so really at the heart of this is set in a world where everyone has a set amount of time to live. This is invisible to most people, but there's kind of an order beneath the surface that knows this truth. And Mark, his whole life has been plagued because he's seen people around him that he loves and cares about die, and he feels like life is unfair. And when he tries to take his own life, he realizes he can't die because his time isn't up. And that's when the secret order kind of emerges and says, you have been living beyond your time because someone has been killing everyone you love around you and giving their time to you. And we need to figure out why. And so this kind of mystery unfolds about, okay, this new truth of the world is unveiled. Everyone has a set amount of time, but you're unique in that you're living beyond that. And that is creating chaos in this world. And really, it is a manifestation, a realization of this kind of thing that I feel like we all universally feel, like there are clocks ticking over our head. And there feels like there needs to be a reason of why people die when they do. And we bring that to life in this story and really explore it through Mark's world.
It's very much a vengeance tale with, like you said, so much world building around it. To be able to take this character, and in a typical sense, when you look at comics and their exposition, you look at Batman or you look at Spider-Man, there's this pivotal moment that you can see in a frame, which is Bruce's parents are murdered, and of course this instigates him to go on this path of vengeance and becoming the Dark Knight. For Mark, he has all of this death around him, and he chooses to actually succumb to the darkness, to the abyss, and decide, what, I can't deal with this. There are no answers. I'm never going to see the truth of this world because it's meaningless, pointless. What's the point to any of this? And who's in charge? Because I want to shake them and punch them in the face. But ultimately, when he does that, he gets the opportunity to, like Andrew said, see how the world works. And then he's given the opportunity to reap vengeance against those who basically, of course, we say everybody he loved. His father committed suicide. His mom died in a freak gas explosion. And his, of course, the love of his life, his wife, was shot in the head. So yes, it's very violent and gruesome, but he finally gets to be in the driver's seat and go, oh, there is a reason why the world is so unfair. And it's because these selfish people are trying to steal all the time from these living souls to live forever.
And I think really what has helped us in writing this and sharing the story with others is, although it feels like the exposition is large or the world is new and big, it really touches on some universal feelings that I think we all have. Like, is there a reason we're alive? Is there a reason that some people die when they do? I mean, I think that those are just real visceral emotions that help you through the labor of getting through this new world.
And throughout the series, we'll actually answer all those questions. So
let's talk about some of the actual mechanics of how that premise plays out. Because one of the things I think that you've done very well in this comic is to just visually represent these things, almost like you would in a video game. Like, you know, if he's looking through these special phone cameras, you can sort of see bars on people's heads, above people's heads, and, you know, they're colored differently to mean different things, and you kind of see them kind of going up and down, or down, I guess, mostly in this scenario. But like, it's a very quick, simple, clear visual idea that you're getting across there. The differentiation, again, it reminds me of a video game in some respects. So I wonder, just first off, did you have any particular, and also, just by the way, the masks that the Order wears reminds me to some degree of Hotline Miami. Like, I'm wondering if you have any inspiration from that direction, or from just video games in as an influence.
We love video games, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the video game that comes to mind would be like Dead Rising, where you're meeting an ensemble of cast. There is a global clock ticking. It's really hard to save everyone, and you've got to make some really interesting decisions when you're going through the mall infested by zombies of who you're going to save and what you're going to prioritize. A non-video game example that we talk a lot about is like Death Note, where there is a certain group of people, you know, in the Death Note world, the Shinigami can kind of see when people are supposed to die, and only by trading a part of your soul can a human get that power too. And so both of those kinds of things combine to creating this really interesting dynamic of, you know, there is a hidden truth from humans that appear to be true to everyone else in the Death Note world, and I really love that aspect too.
And Johnny, you've got context, I guess, to the listeners. You know, the Order operates like this to maintain the balance of the world. They have markers who basically mark people for death. They have agents who locate these people who are overdue, and then these enforcers who are basically serial killers you can summon like Pokemon to kill these people who are overdue. And so Mark joins as a marker. Yes, mark of death. It's all very funny. Marker, marks. So, but he basically, using a cell phone, can visualize these different disruptions within the Order and then mark those people. And so with that, it was also kind of augmented reality that was also an inspiration in general, of, because when you meet Mark, he's a process server, and the way that he serves people, which is his form of quote unquote serving justice, is he has to take a picture of people every time he delivers their papers. And so what's funny is he hates his job, and then ultimately he basically has to do this job, essentially the exact same job, except this time they're dying
for death. Yeah.
So, but that's generally the mechanics of how that ends up working.
It's also admirable that you've got a cell phone in there and it's not boring. Like, I always, when I teach screenwriting, I always lecture students about how the least cinematic thing in the world is a telephone call. Of course, they're not really making calls on these phones, which is part of the reason it's not boring. But I'm curious to know, like, how you settled on the cell phone as a particular kind of touchstone device.
You know, for us, we hate cell phones. Like, film and television is also where we kind of work and play. And so we never like having cell phones in scripts, but this really made sense because we looked at it and said, over time, how does this Order basically evolve over the course of centuries? Did it start with scrolls? At some point, was it, you know, some sort of magic wand device, you know? And so he said, well, now there's something that's so common and also familiar with a cell phone that everybody understands it. There's no extra mechanics that you have to engineer. Everybody knows how a phone works and the materials that are on it. And what's cool though is that we said, hey, you're going to get more powers through the cell phone with access to apps and to access to, soon Mark will be able to not only control time and basically move things and, there's endless possibilities and powers of kind of these updates that happen with the phone, but also because we love the idea of creating the phone as a character, having this hilarious voice, this companion that's going to become more of a character throughout the series, of being able to comment. And there's going to be a badge system where it's like great kill, and it's kind of this comedy tongue-in-cheek way of handling a lot of the very serious life and death scenarios that he goes through.
And it's a real visceral augmented reality lens. It's a real easy way to see, like, the world appears one way, but when you look through the phone, it appears another. And the phone felt like the easiest way to kind of accomplish that quickly.
And I loved what you said, which is when you were teaching screenwriting, that like don't use, it can be very boring. I love the number one rule of writing, I think, for us is don't ever be boring. And I think in general, it's because if it's boring, it's clearly not important to the story or pushing the plot forward or pushing the character arc forward, or, so it was something where we wanted to make the device not the talking point, but Mark's reaction to having to do this ridiculous, violent marking as his new profession.
You got a great point about the potential for like updates or new apps, new powers that's inherent in an object like a cell phone. It reminds me of a writing technique that I've heard. I think it was best explored. I've heard it best explored by Neil Gaiman, where he talks about he was put on trial, or he was in when they were doing the trial where Gaiman and others were suing Todd McFarlane. There was one point where Gaiman was testifying, and one of the things that he noted was that he had created the character of Cogliostro in Spawn in order to, because as Gaiman puts it, you always need to have this oracle figure show up early in a comic series who knows more than the character does, and just hints at things that are coming, because this way, he says, this way it seems like the writer knows what they're doing. It seems like there's a plan. Yeah, like it's a great tool to have something like that cell phone, where it's like it's got like a position and it has a structural like value. It has this clear way in which it's kind of anchoring you to the premise with a familiar object, but also you've got the potential to kind of develop the story in different directions, because of that malleability that's inherent in that particular type of object. It's a very clever use of the device for sure. Do you have what's your sort of future plan in this, in the sense of like how far out have you mapped this particular story?
We mapped it out really far. So, this is volume 1, and for us that we bought out of 36. And we've already begun the adaptation into a television series and how that functions, and because basically we love telling stories, whatever the genre, whatever the medium. And so we planned it out pretty far of exactly kind of where this story goes. And there's a device that's already built into the concept, right? With a structural device and a rails that we've kind of put people on, which is there's the 12, and Mark is hunting down the 12. And so each issue is basically bringing him closer to facing the leader of the 12, which is the Rat. And spoiler alert, I guess we can give away a spoiler.
Yeah.
At the end of the first issue, this double issue, it's Mark's father, who he thought was dead. So there's a very large story of what happened in the past and how all these people are connected. And the people who actually bring Mark into the fold, these agents, they're like, hey, we're going to get you what you want. You can get vengeance against the person who killed your wife. But really, she also has her own kind of reasoning for bringing Mark into this. And so this order that he joins that's supposed to be fighting for the balance and justice actually also has an incredibly complex interpersonal dynamics and personal motivations that each of these characters have as they work through the series.
And I think like we've broken down a couple of large arcs. The first big arc is as the Order and the 12 are kind of on this collision course to have one epic battle. Mark is going to learn the true motivations of the 12. And then the second large arc after that big battle kind of concludes is, am I on the right side or the wrong side of this fight? And so the second arc would be him grappling with that. And then the third would be him maybe joining the other side. So we've kind of planned this out into really exploring where does Mark sit on the line of balancing order and chaos, and who is doing good and who is doing bad.
Because I think, so for us, some of our favorite stories are, you know, these antagonists. We call them antagonists, but the truth is they're just flawed people equally as our heroes, quote unquote heroes. And ultimately, the question that the series asks is, given the power to decide who lives and who dies, how would you wield it? And I think everybody, you know, Andrew and I always talk about this, which is, if we could create the best world, how would you do it? But the second that you start trying to move those pieces together, you ultimately
create winners and losers.
Yes, it's not such a simple answer. And so, yeah, you'd say, oh, well, let's just kill all the bad people in the world. Well, who defines what that is? and how does that ultimately work? And are monsters born, or are they created? And so it's a very, although it's a very comedic and fast-paced and action-packed kind of story, we wanted to pack all that world building into the first issue, so that the rest of of course, it's very action-packed in the rest of the series too, but you don't have all that explained at once, and you can really enjoy the character arcs and then grappling with these questions. Because the first issue is really Mark learning about the world, and he kind of he just kind of accepts what's happening. I mean, because later on, as you see in the first issue, he's like, okay, I said yes to this, but I didn't really know what I was saying yes to. I let that emotion of vengeance kind of just drive me forward. And then slowly he's like, oh, I said yes to this really horrific, terrible thing, but I guess I'm in it now, because I still do want to take down these bad people.
Yeah, in a sense, is a fish out of water pilot, right? Like, you know, he's thrown into this situation. He's getting all this information thrown at him as things are happening. So he's sort of taking it in as the audience is taking it in. So you get like that buy in a sense, right? Where like the audience wants to know, he needs to know. It's all kind of coming fast. You've got lots of stuff happening, so it's not boring. And then you've got inherent in that structure of this first issue is you've got that great cliffhanger, and you've got, as you say, this setup of the 12. Like, so there's like a structure to, like, even like a loose structure to like where the story is going. It's going to go through these. You're going to figure out who these 12 are. It's going to go one after the other. You're doing a lot of work, in other words, like that often writers neglect doing in their first issue. And I'm curious to know what your background is before you come into this issue as creators.
About like just our personal backgrounds in general?
You know, backgrounds as creatives, like this can't be the first, you know, story you've written. I would hope,
Okay.
imagine not. Like, for example, like, you know, you say you got a background in film and television, you're saying?
Yeah, so Andrew and I have been, we've been creative partners for 10 plus years. We've known each other. And so whether that be narrative television, pilots, or documentary, feature films. And so, you know, that whole 10,000 hours kind of trope is very true. It's, you know, we've spent so many hours working on stories and breaking stories, but we've always been attracted to things that are inherently very complex. And so, you know, whether that's multi-perspective stories or whether it's really large worlds, we like taking these very big concepts and being able to whittle them down into something incredibly digestible. So, I mean,
I mean, you know, after undergrad, we went to undergrad school together at Florida State University. Our first project was a documentary series about abusive drug and alcohol rehab programs. So it sent us around the United States, really diving deep into this world that we didn't know much about, the troubled teen industry. And then from there, we just kind of got into more television and commercial work. I also later on went to USC and got an MFA in screenwriting to more focus on the writing aspect of it, because it was the part of creation that we both loved. And we had these ideas that were so big that we were like, oh man, it's going to be impossible to get this greenlit as a pilot, but we have to get this art out there. So comic books was kind of this obvious calling that we both loved. And it was a really exciting opportunity to take these very big visuals we had and these really dense stories and to like put them into frames and really get them out there. And we were very lucky to meet Steve Gordon, who was an animator on the X-Men Evolution. He did the original character designs for X-Men Evolution. And so he really helped bring life and color to this world. So it's a lot of great conversations and cool collaborations.
Yeah.
Yeah, that art is exceptional. I mean, everything in this comic is extremely well done. I gotta say that I'm not used to seeing a first issue that's so well done, and in particular on the story level. Like even often when you have flashy art like this, and there's a lot going on visually, what I'll typically see, and this is true even of the big two, is the story doesn't necessarily anchor properly, and they're depending too much often on, for example, big two will depend a lot on your familiarity with the characters. Whereas you don't have that luxury. Um, so you got a harder job to do in a sense. And what people will often do, I find in these first issues, in indie issues, is they will forget to have plot, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And this, and they will kind of set things up like you're doing, but they won't necessarily pay things off. And I know it's hard to do that in fish issue, but like you, for example, with your cliffhanger, the reveal you mentioned, where we see earlier his father commit suicide. His father even has that sort of line, this isn't really, the end kind of thing. But and then like of course that comes right back around by the end of the issue, and we see like who the rat is. He doesn't know yet, but we, the audience, know. So that kind of setup payoff is something that is really integral, I think, in an issue of this type. But it's something that people often neglect, especially when they're doing fish out of water, stories. I'm going to call it a pilot, even though it's a comic, but it's kind of in that structure, right? Where often they'll have the character dragged through the situation, which is sort of happening here. But one of the things, a good version of that always has to have this element that you do have in here, which is the idea that this character is actually necessary to the situation. Like so often that fish out of water story, it'll just be happenstance almost that this character has come into the story, as opposed to a situation where it's very clear, very fast, and they are clear on the fact that they're necessary to this situation, that it's been engineered. In the case of Mark, it's been engineered around him and for him on a certain level. So one of the things that it seems to me it starts to kind of tap into a little bit is almost this idea of survivor's guilt. If I wonder if you could talk a bit about like how that kind of plays into the character Mark, and to what degree you would kind of build that in as a theme intentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Mark, it's why was I left behind? Why did all the people that I love get taken away from me, and I got to stay here and watch it all happen? And I think one thing that inspired Andrew and I is, we kind of materialized this during the pandemic when we lost people and witnessed everybody facing the very real reality of death, just like in their face. Like you couldn't escape that concept. You're at home and you're thinking about it. And you think, I remember the early days of the pandemic where like, if I touch a surface, I'll die. And so it's so present. And then it was asking, oh my gosh, look at all the loved ones that we've lost, or look at just loved ones we've lost in our lives. Andrew and I have been very unfortunate to face loss early on in our lives, and to be able to say, okay, well, why did we get to live? Why do these beautiful souls have to be taken away? And we see all the corruption and pain that other individuals cause in this world, and why do they get to live? And that really is very important for Mark's journey, because first of all, Mark got the love of his life taken away, but not only is it the physical embodiment of survivor's guilt, it's because all her time went to him. So he's living on her time. And of course, in the comic, we call that borrowed time. He's living on borrowed time. So it's carrying that guilt in the physical form. And that's how we chose to physicalize that trauma that he carries with him. Because it is very much, it's also an exploration of trauma in general, because you have this individual who's faced death in such awful, terrible ways. And you don't feel the weight of that in the first issue, but you'll definitely feel the weight of that as you continue on throughout the series.
And I think like another really important part of it is everyone is a hero in their own story. This is obviously Mark's story, and what has happened to him is incredibly tragic. But as we've kind of hinted at with the spoiler at the end, and what you'll learn in these future issues, is that it's happening to him with the best of intentions. Mark's father is keeping him alive. And so two things are true. The father is doing something he knows to be right and good, but it is having these really traumatic effects on his son. And I think that's really true in our own world, where parents always try to do the best for their kids, and yet intentionally or unintentionally they cause harm, they cause trauma, they affect their kids' lives. And so it really is like a real visceral way to say, what are the ramifications for our best intentions?
Because really, that's just like Andrew said, any father would try to keep their child alive, whatever the cost. But,
not knowing that that cost is trauma.
Yeah. And that cost will be the survivor's guilt that Mark carries with him, and the immense, anger, depression at the world, and why he sees it as unfair, when the reality is it's kind of his dad's fault.
And ironically, it makes him want to die.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess that also, that feeling like when you're living on borrowed time in this world, you feel like you should be dead, like your time was up, like that it's over, and that the other people should be alive. And I think that's something, maybe that's something I feel sometimes. Maybe not everybody feels it, but I think that that's something that people feel.
Well, I think you bring up the pandemic, which is an interesting thing. Without getting too deep in the pandemic, I think what people, even today, we're kind of in this post, everyone calls it post-pandemic society, which I think is hilarious always, because, I remember when the pandemic started, not to get into it, but like, I remember when the pandemic started, people were like, well, we need to do this, that, and the other thing. I go, yes, that's true, but it is a pandemic. By definition, it means it cannot be controlled. When you're post-pandemic, all that simply means is, you're endemic now, right? So what people often forget in the culture, at least where I am here, is like they'll make comments like, oh, well, there's no milk at the grocery store today. It's like, how come there, nobody wants to work at McDonald's? It's like, it's not that they don't want to, it's that they're dead. And like we're still living in this scenario of like this supply chain has broken down for varied reasons. Some of it has to do with, trade wars, but a lot of it just has to do with, labor shortages. And, there's root causes to all that. And as you say, just to sort of shift it more into kind of the economy and arena of your story here. In that scenario, if you make the one shift, the other things start to kind of fall out of place too. Like as you almost have a weird version of supply chain breakdown in Mark of Death, where like death is not being parceled out properly and not being delivered in the right places at the right times, right? It's kind of a weird metaphor to extend perhaps, but there is very much that sense in the story, and I think it comes across very clearly alongside all this high octane, action that's going on. You do have very clearly have this sort of idea that, well, this abstract thing, death itself, is basically just not working in the way that the economy of death is supposed to have been working. As you say, it's been manipulated almost just like, the price of gold might be manipulated, right? Like it has this sort of way in which it's shifting and being pushed by outside forces, but it also is its own internal force that's always trying to get back into an equilibrium. So like what I like about this so much is the tension is inherent in the premise and inherent in like the whole concept. So you've got this additional level of Mark, as a conflicted character. The guy his father's trying to keep him alive. That makes him want to die, but then it turns out he can't die. Now has to, obviously on some level, down the line here, if Mark were to sit in this issue and think through all the information he's been given, one of the things that, of course, he would realize is that if he succeeds, then he will die. Right. And at a certain point, and of course, I'm not spoiling anything because I'm just reading the first issue.
No.
So you don't have to confirm or deny anything. But but with the writer's eye, I'm looking at this thinking, well, by the time he has to make the decision to die, of course, he may want to live at that point. There's like real clear trajectories that he's kind of potentially on track for, which gets you into really interesting areas, and it really helps. I think it's so cleanly set up. I wonder how hard it was for you to write this. As you say, you've got quite an extensive writing background, but like how hard was it to really get the elements working in a story where you're explaining a lot, but also having things happen? Like what did your kind of editing and drafting process look like?
Well, the first thing we did was we wrote it first as in the traditional model that we were trained in, which is as a pilot. We wrote it down and we said, we want a really great cold open. We want something that's engaging for audiences to immediately go, okay, I really want to get into this story within the first 2 pages. We wanted a really clean outro, an exit that, with a cliffhanger that said, oh, I really need to watch this next episode. And then we really just, the device that we invented, it started with Mark as the character, which we always love starting with character, because there's what's driving us, which is when you have a character who wants to die so bad, but he can't die. So, that concept really opened itself up. But we knew we wanted it to be a comedy. We wanted it to be a dark, rich comedy, because that's how the medicine goes down. We love to consider ourselves artists, but the truth is and for so long I resisted this. I was like, oh, if it's commercial, it's not art. I was like, that was my young mindset. But it's like, no, if it's commercial, people will see it and they'll get the message and it'll reach the most people. And so we wanted to make something that we thought was so accessible to people and so exciting for a large audience, but while simultaneously had all those messages we've been talking about. You kind of very aptly brought up the point of this kind of economy of death. I mean, in this series, time is a commodity, and in our lives, time is a commodity. How, what position we're in, when we're born, and what time we're given, or what time we inherit, or, what time we work towards defines the path of our life. And that's very much clear in this story. But we started with that script phase and the character, and just really explored how, I mean, the reason that the first issue is a double issue is because it is far too large to put into a single issue. All these concepts, it really is an hour-long pilot that has been condensed into these really intense double issue.
And I feel like I'm going to quote like all of the writing books that exist in the world, which is writing is rewriting, the editing process is everything. And I can't emphasize this enough. The rigorous editing that we went through to get to this final version is profound. That this is definitely not the first or second draft. This is the 30th or 40th or 50th draft. And I think that that's what I love working with Elle León, is that we really have large conversations. We really put everything on the whiteboard. And then we go through a time consuming, emotionally draining, gladiator arena of what is important, like what sings. It's what is the rule of cool is great, but it's not the only thing. You've got to it has to be a touchstone on many levels. And our objective really is every scene, every line, every concept works in more than one way. And that is truly only accomplished through trying lots of things and resolving that you can only have a couple of things. And then your point about making it commercial and fitting kind of these known truisms about what makes a project successful, or at least palatable to an audience, companioning that with the rich stuff that we talk about so often. And that comes from nothing more than iterations and editing.
And one thing I will add to that also is, even after the script is done and then the panels are drawn by an amazing artist, even then we were editing, because once these images were coming to life, you're like, okay, well, we need an added beat here, or this isn't clear enough. How do we take these incredibly visual concepts? And again, I can gush about Stephen Gordon all day. He's a genius and an amazing artist, and he turned a lot of these, obviously it was a very collaborative process, but he would come up with these ideas and be like, oh my gosh, you nailed it. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Thank you so much. I don't know how to, and then other times it would be like, I don't know how to explain this to you, but Andrew and I have this idea, but we don't know how to really visualize it. This is what we want. And so it's such a back and forth to be able to make sure that cohesion between the story and the images actually played out.
Why do you think so many writers resist that kind of prep work prior to getting the issue together, like whiteboarding, outlining in that kind of way, going over and over the beats?
I know this. I see it all the time, and it hurts me so much. We've been so blessed with amazing mentors, and I cannot stress mentorship enough in terms of multi-generational friendships and people who can inspire you, who've been doing it forever. But people are so impatient. And I think as artists, we are so impatient, and we just want it to be a thing. We want it to be birthed immediately. and so we're like, whatever, we don't need to do that. We have a great idea for a comic. Let's hire an artist before we have the concept, but that's okay. You see this in the studio system with movies that fail terribly, where it's like, well, we don't have a script, but we really should get into production on, Superman 36. So it's like, it's terrible to watch, but one thing that I love working with Andrew is we sit down and we go, okay, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it right. And yes, it will take longer, but the work that will come out will not be shorthanded. And when you shorthand your prep and you shorthand your, you really, you hinder your creative process and development process, you hinder your final product. You have to constantly be challenging yourself to be better. And yes, as people say, projects are not finished, they're abandoned. But you need to make sure that at a certain point you did everything. I can safely say, and I think I can speak for both of us, we looked at this comic and go, we did this is great, we like this. Sure, people are going to have what we call flavor notes, which is, why did you do this instead of that? But we're happy with it and we enjoy it, and I can pick it up and read it 5 times over and say, this is so fun and I want more. And I think that it's just having that patience. We didn't settle for the first artist we found. A lot of people do, right? We hunted. We didn't settle for the first colorist we found. We hunted. And it takes that level of patience, which I know is not fun or sexy or exciting, but you have to do it.
And I saw this a lot at USC. You have these really, a cohort of really beautiful, amazing, talented artists who have these really great ideas that come from this deep place. And then they write a scene that doesn't work and they go, fuck it, I'm not going to do this movie anymore. And you're like, oh, wait, no, but that was so great. Why did you, they fall out of love with their own work. And I think that really, to get to the great end product, you have to find that love for your own work, even when it's hard. And one way that I think we get over that is we do a lot of focused passes, which is sometimes we're just focused on character dialogue. Sometimes we're just focused on the emotional essence of a scene. And we try to really compartmentalize what our target is for that day's session, and looking at that one piece of art through many lenses to make sure it works on all of those levels is, I think, what drives it to a better place all around. And also allows me to fall back in love with different aspects of it, fall back in love with the characters, fall back in love with the concept. And that really helps.
And the last thing I'll say is work on 2 things at once,
yeah,
or 3 if you can manage. But that way it's, okay, fine, I can work on this until noon. And if I'm angry at it and I'm frustrated at it and I don't want to look at it anymore, I have something else. And then that will inspire you to do something else. So.
You mentioned before the idea of kind of going over things and making them kind of work 2 ways. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that, because that's something that I think is really fundamentally important. And whenever I teach creative writing, I try to say it. The way I put it is, you want things to kind of be double tasking. Like if somebody's saying to, hey, let's meet at Joe's, that's no good, because there's only one thing that's happening. They're getting information across. Can they say it as a joke, where you're laughing, and also you're getting information across? Can they say it in a way that communicates, how they feel about this other character, and also gets the information across? Can they, whatever it is, if they're moving their hand to go pick up a can of pop, can they do it in a way that looks cool? Is there can somebody shoot it while they're picking it up? Can you get 2 things packed together like that? There's a really economical method of writing in there, in the heart of that idea of trying to make everything work twice, in 2 ways. And I wonder if you can kind of share maybe some of your own kind of tips for when you're looking at a draft or going over the script again, or the pages when the art's coming in or whatever. Maybe you're doing, finalizing letters at a later stage. But what are some of the things you're kind of looking for or doing to kind of make sure that things are hitting on all cylinders for you in that kind of way?
I think in general, it's, if a character, obviously every scene has a purpose. That's one thing. I mean, you start there, and if the purpose is exposition or whatever, if you can take that emotional core of the scene and personify that, physicalize that into the action, so there's a mirroring that's happening, you know, because you want to not only learn, okay, Mark is learning the fact that he's on borrowed time. Well, you know, you're also bringing him forth through this environment where he's facing death. You know, there's a birth of a child and a death of a mother, you know, and so you're taking not only this vocalized concept, but you're personifying it within the world itself. And that's how I think you can engage in that, making sure it's not just two characters sitting down and talking about this one thing and nothing else happens, you know. And sometimes that happens in the real world and you want that, but if there's a way to make sure that the setting itself is representative of that. I mean, even just a very simple example is the bar scene with Mark. It's probably the only scene in the entire comic where two characters are sitting down and just talking, but Mark is getting tanked. And it's before he decides that he's going to, of course, take his own life, which makes perfect sense that he's going to get tanked beforehand. But you find out, funnily enough, in dialogue at the scene, that it's actually Travis's birthday and they're trying to get this drink. And he's just like, it should have been us. You know? And it's like, well, it wouldn't be, you know, happy hour if we didn't talk about her death at least once, right? And so I think that there's ways to engage people, even if it's not necessarily an action that's exciting, but it's making kind of the setting surprise you. And so if you're not surprising people while simultaneously pushing the story forward, then I think there's more work to be done within that scene.
And maybe to deconstruct the problem from another way, one of my pet peeves of TV shows and movies is when you repeat information. How often do you see somebody going through a mystery and it's like, they're after the president? Who? The president? What are they? They're after him. And it's like, okay, I get it, guys. And in our conversations about throwing everything on the whiteboard, we have so much stuff that can't possibly fit into one episode that when it comes to like optimizing the scene and making things efficient or double tasking, we go, how can we include these little nuggets that will definitely pay off in issue 3 that we can introduce here? And so we really start from a place of abundance where we have a lot of great ideas and a lot of them are being cut and a lot of them are falling on the cutting room floor. But trying to find with each edit ways to slot those things in. Is the scene boring? Are we repeating information? Well, let's bring this idea that's about to come up. And you were talking about the oracle that kind of, you know, shows the hand of where the story is going. We try to weave that in from a place of, we've got more story than we can fit into a story. So let's do as much as we can with each piece.
Well, and also when you know you have another great last tidbit from an amazing mentor was, you know, write down 30 things your character can do in regards to that scene and then write one more. And it's that 31st that's always the special one. It's okay, yeah, it could be at a bar, but it could also be at a clown party. It could be, you know, and obviously you remember kind of where it reflects within your story. But if you're challenging yourself over and over again to say, how can this scene be better, you'll always find something unique.
And I think a great example of that in this comic is they meet these people who are, you know, overdue, and they assume their identities to go buy time. And where do they buy time? From a human trafficker who is trafficking children. Like, you know, what an interesting way to explain why people in this world get human trafficked, to steal their life force. And we don't really go too deep into that aspect of it, but it's a hidden layer that will be more deeply explored as we get into this world, that I think is a great example of how we double time that information.
Yeah, one of the great things about that particular scene is because you had kind of set it up the idea. Once you bring in the human trafficking element, it's just click, click, click. Like it's obvious kind of what's happening. It doesn't need to be explained again. So as you say, you don't need to kind of repeat the information. That is one of my pet peeves too. Although my biggest pet peeve in like thriller, like cop shows, that kind of thing, is when people explain the job that they do every day to the other person who also does that job every day. You know, it's like the two lab techs, and one's going like, now it's time to use the centrifuge, which is going to do this. And it's like, well, she uses centrifuge all the day. That's her job. Yes. Like, what are you talking about it for? It's so it just drives me nuts. But anyways, it's been really great talking to you guys. What more do people need to know about Mark of Death, and where can they find out more about Mark of Death?
This is just the beginning. So that's the big thing, which is we're going to Comic-Con. We're going to be on a Comic-Con panel in San Diego. Come visit our booth. Our publisher is Bliss Publishing. Stephen Gordon's going to be there. He's going to have his own booth. So please come visit us, support the comic, and obviously our amazing publisher, who has another slew of amazing comics as well. And you can get it on the Bliss on Tap publishing website. You can order a digital copy through Amazon. We're going to have exclusive comic variants at Comic-Con. So one by Howard Chaykin, Alex Cormack, Stephen Gordon's doing a San Diego Comic-Con variant cover himself.
Instagram, Mark of Death Comic at Instagram. That's a great way to follow the series as it unfolds for future issues too.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for talking to me, and keep writing the wrong way.